The merciless Arizona sun beat down on the parched earth of the summer of 1879, casting harsh shadows across the rugged landscape. Nahimana's heart pounded against her ribs as her father, Kami, led her along the dusty trail toward the cluster of wooden buildings that made up the small settlement of Copper Springs. Her legs felt heavy with each step, as if her body was resisting the journey that her mind already knew would change her life forever. The worn deerskin of her moccasins, once a source of pride when she had crafted them the previous winter, now seemed to carry the weight of her dread. Her younger sister Taluta's fever had worsened steadily over the past 3 days. What had begun as a slight warmth to the touch had escalated into violent shivering despite the summer heat, her small body burning like the coals of their cooking fire. The medicine woman, old Apache with her hands gnarled like juniper roots, had tried every herb and remedy passed down through generations of Apache healers. The bitter tea of willow bark, poultices of sage and juniper, prayers to the spirits that had protected their people since time immemorial. None had broken the fever's grip on Taluta's frail body. "Father, please," Nahimana whispered in Apache, her voice catching in her throat like a thorn. The familiar syllables of their native tongue felt like a final connection to everything she was about to lose. There must be another way. Perhaps if we asked the agent. Kimi's weathered face remained impassive, though his eyes, deep brown like the earth after rain, betrayed the anguish that no father should have to bear. The lines around his mouth, once formed from laughter in better days, now seemed carved by grief and desperation. "The white man's medicine costs money we do not have," he replied, his voice low and rough from disuse. Since their confinement to the reservation, Keme had grown increasingly silent, as if the words themselves had been stolen along with their ancestral lands. "Taluta will die without it. The agent has turned us away twice already. He says there are no more supplies until the next government shipment." The San Carlos Reservation had been established only 4 years prior, and their people, the proud Chiricahua Apache, who had once roamed freely across vast territories, had been forcibly relocated from the mountains they had known for generations. They were now confined to this barren stretch of land where little would grow and where the spirits of their ancestors could not find them. Game was scarce, with the best hunting grounds now claimed by white settlers. The government rations, promised in the treaties that were broken almost as soon as they were signed, never arrived in the quantities needed to sustain the growing number of Apache forced onto the increasingly crowded reservation. Disease spread quickly through the cramped conditions, especially among the children and the elderly. Measles had swept through the previous winter, taking 7 children from their band alone. Now, a mysterious fever was claiming more lives each week. The Apache way of life was dying by deliberate design, and now Taluta might die with it. Nahimana fell silent, the futility of further protest evident in her father's rigid shoulders and determined stride. At 19 summers, she understood the desperate reality of their situation better than most. She had watched her mother succumb to a similar fever just 8 months earlier, her once vibrant spirit fading day by day, until nothing remained but an empty shell to be wrapped in a burial shroud. The U.S. Army had confined them to land that could barely sustain them, and the once proud Apache hunters now depended on meager government handouts, distributed with callous irregularity by officials who viewed them as little more than an inconvenience. Her father had already traded away their few remaining valuables for food and blankets last winter, her mother's beaded necklace, the ceremonial knife that had belonged to his grandfather, even the painted buffalo hide that had recorded their family's history for generations. All gone now, exchanged for survival. The trading post stood at the edge of town, a weathered wooden structure with a broad porch shaded by an overhanging roof. Several men lounged outside on wooden chairs, tilted back against the wall, their conversation halting abruptly as the Apache pair approached. Nahimana kept her eyes lowered, a habit born of bitter experience, but she could feel their gazes crawling over her skin like desert scorpions. "Well, look what we have here," a balding man with tobacco-stained teeth said, spitting a brown stream into the dust near Nahimana's feet. The acrid smell of the tobacco juice mixed with the scent of unwashed bodies and cheap whiskey. "What brings you to town, Indian?" "Reservations that way." He gestured vaguely eastward with a grimy hand. Keme straightened his shoulders, summoning dignity despite the circumstances. Though he spoke little English, he had rehearsed the necessary words on the long walk from the reservation, muttering them under his breath like a prayer. "My daughter," he said, the unfamiliar words awkward on his tongue. "Trade for medicine." He gestured toward Nahimana, who stood rigid with shock as she finally realized the full meaning of what her father intended. The blood drained from her face, leaving her lightheaded and nauseous. "No," she breathed, switching to the English she had learned during her 3 years at the reservation school before she had been pulled out to help care for her ailing mother. "Father, you cannot—" The words stuck in her throat, choked by horror and disbelief. "Silence," Keme hissed in Apache, his eyes both pleading and commanding. "For your sister's life, for our family's survival." His voice softened slightly. "You are strong, Nahimana. Stronger than this place. Stronger than what is to come." The trader, a man named Wilkins according to the crudely painted sign above the door, looked Nahimana up and down with an appraising eye that made her skin crawl. His gaze lingered on the curves of her body, barely concealed by her simple dress, and the long, straight black hair that hung down her back in a thick braid. "How old?" he asked, addressing Keme, but staring at Nahimana as if she were a mare at auction. 19 summers, Keme replied, his voice betraying nothing of the turmoil that must have been raging within him. "Can she cook? Clean?" Wilkins' questions were practical, but the gleam in his eyes suggested other considerations. "Yes," Keme answered simply. Nahimana had indeed learned both skills. Apache women were expected to maintain the home, but she had also excelled at the domestic arts taught by the white missionary women at the school, hoping the knowledge might somehow bridge the widening gap between her people and the encroaching settlers. The men on the porch exchanged glances, their meaning clear even to Nahimana, who felt sick with dread. One of them, younger than the others with a blonde mustache and red-rimmed eyes, licked his lips and whispered something to his companion that made them both laugh. Nahimana had seen what happened to Apache women taken by white men. Those who returned to the reservation were often broken in spirit, sometimes carrying half-white children that would never fully belong in either world. Just then, a tall figure emerged from the shadowy interior of the trading post. Jacob Miller had been listening to the exchange while collecting supplies for his isolated ranch 15 miles outside of town. He had not intended to involve himself in the transaction. He had learned long ago to mind his own business in a territory where a man's survival often depended on his ability to look the other way. But something about the quiet dignity of the Apache girl, standing straight-backed despite her obvious fear, had stirred something long dormant within him. "I'll take her," he said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence like a knife. The other men turned to him with varying expressions of surprise. "You, Miller?" Wilkins remarked with a smirk that revealed tobacco-stained teeth. "Thought you preferred your own company out there in the hills. Been what, 2 years since you've brought a woman around?" "Need help with the ranch," Jacob replied simply, ignoring the implied question. He was a man of few words, known in town as a loner, who came in only when necessary for supplies or to sell his cattle. Rumors swirled about his past. Some said he'd lost a wife and child to fever back east. Others claimed he'd killed a man in a dispute over land. Whatever the truth, Jacob Miller kept to himself, and most people in Copper Springs were content to leave it that way. He approached Kime and spoke directly, his manner neither condescending nor overly familiar. "I'll give you enough for medicine and food for 3 months. He named a sum that made Wilkins' eyebrows rise and the men on the porch mutter among themselves. Nahimana stared at the stranger, tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a winter sky. His dark beard was flecked with gray, and deep lines marked the corners of his eyes. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps 40, with hands calloused from work and a scar that ran along his jawline, partially hidden by his beard. His clothes were plain but clean, a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms, denim pants worn at the knees, and sturdy boots covered in the red dust of the territory. "She will be treated fair," Jacob added, meeting Nahimana's gaze briefly. Something in his expression, not pity but perhaps understanding, made her straighten her shoulders. If this was to be her fate, she would face it with the courage expected of an Apache woman. Kem studied the rancher's face, searching for deception or cruelty. Finding neither, he nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. "Medicine first," he said. "For my younger daughter." Jacob agreed without hesitation. "The doctor's office is 2 doors down. We'll go there now, settle the bill, then complete our business." The next hour passed in a blur for Nahimana. She stood silently as Jacob paid the town's only doctor to visit the reservation and treat Taluta, providing enough medicine for a month. The doctor, a gray-haired man with spectacles perched on a bulbous nose, seemed surprised at the arrangement, but asked no questions when Jacob added extra payment for your discretion. At the general store, Jacob purchased flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples that would feed Nahimana's family for weeks. Kame accepted these provisions with solemn gratitude, his eyes meeting Nahimana's in a silent apology that she acknowledged with a slight nod. They both understood the brutal calculus of survival, one daughter traded to save another, and to prevent the remaining family from starving. The formal transaction was completed at the trading post, where Jacob signed papers that Wilkins produced from a drawer beneath the counter. Nahimana noticed that her name appeared nowhere on the document, only a description. One Apache female, approximately 19 years. In good health. The impersonal language underscored her new status as property rather than person. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Nahimana found herself in Jacob Miller's wagon, a canvas-covered conveyance pulled by 2 sturdy draft horses. Her few possessions, a change of clothes, a small pouch containing her mother's bone hairpins, and a woven blanket, were stowed in the back alongside Jacob's supplies. She sat rigidly on the wooden seat, watching her father grow smaller in the distance. The wagon of provisions he pulled, heading back toward the reservation, where Taluta waited, burning with fever. Her entire world had been reduced to a sack of possessions and the dusty road ahead, leading to an unknown future with a man who had bought her as casually as he had purchased the sacks of flour and salt, stacked in the back of the wagon. The familiar mountains that had cradled her people for generations receded behind them as the horses plodded steadily westward toward the setting sun. "I know what you're thinking," Jacob said, after they had traveled in silence for several miles, the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic plodding of the horses' hooves, the only sounds in the vast landscape. His voice was neither harsh nor particularly gentle, simply matter of fact. "But I'm not looking for a wife or anything else." Nahimana remained silent, her face a careful mask that revealed nothing of the fear and anger roiling beneath the surface. She had learned early in her dealings with white people that showing emotion was often perceived as weakness, and weakness invited exploitation. "My ranch needs tending, the house needs care, that's all," Jacob continued, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. The ruddy light of the setting sun cast his profile in stark relief against the darkening eastern sky. "You'll have your own room with a lock on the door. You'll be safe." She finally spoke, her English careful but clear, each word deliberately chosen. "I am not free. How can I be safe?" Jacob's hands tightened on the reins, the only indication that her words had affected him. "No," he admitted after a moment, surprising her with his candor. "You're not free, but neither am I." As the wagon rumbled toward the distant mountains now painted purple in the fading light, Nahimana wondered what chains bound this solitary white man, and whether her life at his ranch would be a different kind of prison, or something else entirely. The last traces of daylight slipped below the horizon, leaving them traveling in the gathering darkness, 2 strangers bound together by circumstance and the harsh realities of a land where survival often came at the cost of freedom. Above them, the first stars appeared in the deepening twilight. Nahimana recognized the familiar constellations that had guided her people for countless generations, permanent and unchanging despite the upheaval below. She silently recited the prayer her grandmother had taught her, asking the stars to light her path in darkness. Whatever awaited her at Jacob Miller's ranch, she would face it with the strength of her ancestors and the resilience of the Apache people who had survived centuries of hardship before the white man ever set foot on their lands. The wagon continued westward, carrying her toward an uncertain fate as night claimed the Arizona territory, the rhythmic creaking of the wheels marking the passage of time, and the distance growing between Nahimana and everything she had ever known. The Miller Ranch came into view as the sun began its descent behind the rugged hills. It was larger than Nahimana had expected, a two-story house of rough-hewn timber, a barn, corral, and several outbuildings spread across a valley nestled between protective ridges. A creek cut through the property, lined with cottonwoods that provided rare shade in the harsh landscape. "Water year-round," Jacob explained, following her gaze. "That's why I chose this land." As they approached, Nahimana noticed details that spoke of neglect: broken fence posts, a shutter hanging askew, tall weeds encroaching on what might once have been a garden. This was not the home of a prosperous rancher, but of a man barely holding on. Jacob helped her down from the wagon, then unloaded her few possessions. "I'll show you the house," he said, his manner businesslike. Inside, the ranch house was sparsely furnished, but surprisingly spacious. A large main room contained a stone fireplace, a wooden table with chairs, and bookshelves filled with volumes that suggested Jacob Miller was more educated than his rough exterior implied. Dust covered nearly every surface, and the wooden floors needed sweeping. "Kitchen's through there," Jacob said, gesturing to a doorway. "Your room is upstairs, first door on the right. Mine's at the end of the hall." He led her up the narrow staircase to a small but clean bedroom with a real bed, not the pallet on the floor she had expected, and a chest of drawers. A window overlooked the corral and the hills beyond. "There's a key," Jacob said, pointing to the brass lock on the door. "Use it if you want." Nahimana stood in the center of the room, still trying to comprehend her new reality. What do you expect of me?" she finally asked. Jacob leaned against the doorframe, keeping his distance. "Cooking, cleaning, help with the garden. It's gone to seed, but the soil's good. I have 30 head of cattle and some chickens. I can handle the livestock, but I could use help with the rest." He paused, studying her face. "I don't expect you to be grateful. I know you didn't choose this, but it's better than the alternatives those men at the trading post had in mind." The truth of his words hung in the air between them. Nahimana knew what fate likely awaited Apache women sold or captured in these territories. "I will work," she said simply. It was not acceptance, merely acknowledgement of her situation. Jacob nodded. "Get settled. There's a pump in the kitchen for water if you want to wash. I'll tend to the horses and bring your things up." After he left, Nahimana moved to the window and gazed out at the land that was to be her new home. In the distance, she could see the faint outline of mountains that might be near the reservation where her family remained. Her throat tightened with grief and anger. She had been raised to be strong, to endure. The Apache had survived for generations against enemies and harsh conditions. She would survive this too, and perhaps someday find a way back to her people. The next days established a cautious routine. Nahimana rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, simple fare of cornmeal porridge or biscuits. Jacob would eat quickly before heading out to work with the cattle, returning midday for a brief meal, then again at sundown. Their conversations were minimal, practical exchanges about food supplies or tasks needing attention. Jacob kept his distance, true to his word about respecting her space. Sometimes, Nahimana would catch him watching her with an unreadable expression when he thought she wasn't looking. The work was hard but familiar. Nahimana found the rhythm of it almost comforting, sweeping the accumulated dust from corners, washing linens grown stiff with disuse, bringing order to the neglected house. The garden responded to her care, and soon tiny green shoots of beans and squash emerged from the dark soil. One evening, as she served a stew made from rabbit Jacob had trapped, he broke their usual silence. "You're good with plants. The garden's coming along." "My grandmother taught me," Nahimana replied, surprising herself by offering this small piece of her past. Jacob nodded. "My wife had a way with growing things too." The words seemed to escape before he could stop them, and his expression closed immediately. "Your wife?" Nahimana ventured, curiosity overcoming caution. Jacob's jaw tightened. "She's gone. Long time now." "I'm sorry," Nahimana said, the English phrase feeling strange on her tongue, but it seemed appropriate. They ate in silence for several minutes before Jacob spoke again. "Your English is good. I went to the school on the reservation, before ... She trailed off, not wanting to speak of her mother's illness, her sister's fragility, the gradual collapse of her family's world. Before they broke their promises, Jacob finished for her, surprising Nahimana with his bluntness. The government's good at that, making treaties, then finding reasons to ignore them. Nahimana studied him, reassessing. This was not the talk she expected from a white settler. "Why do you live alone?" she asked, emboldened by his unexpected candor. Jacob's eyes met hers across the table. "People disappoint you. Land doesn't." It was a sentiment Nahimana understood all too well. By late August, summer storms rolled across the valley with increasing frequency. The afternoon sky would darken suddenly, releasing torrents of rain that transformed the dusty landscape into flowing rivers before disappearing as quickly as they had come. Nahimana had been at the ranch for nearly 2 months. The house was now clean and orderly, the garden flourishing. She had developed an uneasy truce with Jacob, neither friendship nor true servitude, but a partnership of necessity. He treated her with a detached respect, never raising his voice or making demands beyond the agreed-upon work. One evening, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Jacob returned from town with supplies and an unexpected package. "For you," he said gruffly, placing a small parcel wrapped in brown paper on the table. Nahimana looked at it warily. "What is it?" "Open it." Inside was a book, a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman. Nahimana ran her fingers over the embossed cover in confusion. "I noticed you looking at my books," Jacob explained, seeming almost embarrassed. "Thought you might want something to read." The gesture caught her off guard. It was the first gift she had received since coming to the ranch, perhaps the first acknowledgement that she might have needs beyond physical sustenance. "Thank you," she said carefully, not knowing what else to say. Jacob nodded once, then changed the subject. "Storm's coming, a big one. We should check the barn roof. It was leaking last time." They worked together in the fading light, securing loose shingles on the barn roof. The air grew heavy with electricity as dark clouds gathered above the mountains. "We should get inside," Jacob said, eyeing the approaching wall of rain. "These summer storms can turn dangerous quick." They had barely reached the house when the skies opened. Rain hammered against the roof as wind howled through the valley. Lightning split the darkness, followed by thunder that shook the walls. Nahimana helped Jacob close shutters against the driving rain. As they secured the last window in the main room, a particularly violent gust of wind tore at the house, and a loud crack sounded from upstairs. "The old oak," Jacob muttered. "I've been meaning to trim those branches." They rushed upstairs to find a large limb had crashed through the window of Nahimana's room. Rain poured in, soaking her bed and belongings. "Damn it!" Jacob cursed, quickly assessing the damage. "We can't fix this tonight. You'll have to use the other bedroom." The other bedroom had gone unmentioned until now. Nahimana followed Jacob down the hall to a door that had remained closed since her arrival. He hesitated before opening it, revealing a room that, unlike the rest of the house, seemed frozen in time. A quilt covered a double bed, and a rocking chair sat in the corner. A small wooden cradle stood beside it. The room smelled faintly of lavender and sadness. "It was theirs," Jacob said quietly. "My wife's and son's." Nahimana understood immediately. "I cannot—" "You can," Jacob interrupted. "They're gone. Have been for 15 years. No sense in leaving a good room empty when yours is flooded." He moved to a trunk at the foot of the bed and pulled out fresh linens. "I'll change these. Been too long." Nahimana stood awkwardly in the doorway, aware she was witnessing something deeply private. "What happened to them?" she asked softly. Jacob's hand stilled on the bedding. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. "Fever," he finally said. "Sarah took sick first, then little James. I was away, delivering cattle to Fort Bowie. By the time I got back—" His voice trailed off. "I'm sorry," Nahimana said, the words inadequate for the loss she saw etched in the lines of his face. "It was a lifetime ago," Jacob replied, but the tightness in his voice belied his words. They worked in silence, preparing the room. When it was ready, Jacob moved toward the door. "You'll be comfortable here. I'll see about fixing your window tomorrow." "Jacob," Nahimana said, stopping him. It was the first time she had used his name. "Thank you." He nodded once, then left her alone in the room that held so many ghosts. That night, As rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled across the valley, Nahimana lay awake in the bed that had once belonged to Jacob's wife. She thought about the man down the hall, not as her owner or captor, but as someone who had also lost everything he loved. For the first time since leaving her family, Nahimana allowed herself to weep, her tears mingling with the storm's rain, grieving for all that had been taken from her people, her family, and from the solitary man whose pain seemed to echo her own. Autumn painted the cottonwoods along the creek in shades of gold. 3 months had passed since the storm, and subtle changes had transformed life at the Miller Ranch. Nahimana's window had been repaired, but she had remained in Sarah's room by unspoken agreement. The cradle and rocking chair had been moved to the attic, making the space more hers, though she handled Sarah's remaining possessions, a hairbrush, a faded quilt, with reverence. The tension between her and Jacob had gradually softened into something like friendship. Their evening meals now included conversation, Jacob describing his day with the cattle or sharing stories of his early years in the territory, Nahimana occasionally offering memories of Apache traditions or tales her grandmother had told. She had read the Whitman poetry, struggling with some words but finding unexpected beauty in others. Jacob had noticed and brought more books from town, patiently explaining passages she found difficult. One crisp October morning, as Nahimana gathered the last vegetables from the garden, a rider approached. Jacob was checking fence lines on the north pasture, and she hesitated, unused to dealing with visitors alone. The man who dismounted was a stranger, well-dressed, with a confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Good morning," he called, removing his hat. "I'm looking for Jacob Miller." "He is not here," Nahimana replied cautiously. "He will return soon." The man studied her with undisguised curiosity. "I'm Thomas Garrett from the Indian Affairs Office. And you are—" "Nahimana." "Ah." His expression changed, and Nahimana felt a chill despite the warm morning. "You're the Apache woman Miller purchased in Copper Springs." The blunt description stung, though it was technically accurate. "I work here," she said stiffly. "Yes, I'm sure you do." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "In fact, that's partly why I'm here. There's been some concern about arrangements like yours. The reservation agent has been looking for several young women who left under unusual circumstances." Nahimana's heart quickened. "My family knows where I am." "Perhaps. But there are new regulations about Indians living off reservation without proper documentation." He glanced around the property. "Miller should have registered you with the agency." Before Nahimana could respond, the sound of hoofbeats announced Jacob's return. His expression darkened when he saw the visitor. "Garrett," he acknowledged tersely, dismounting. "What brings you out here?" The agent smiled thinly. "Official business, Miller, regarding your housekeeper here." Jacob positioned himself subtly between Nahimana and Garrett. "What about her?" "She needs to return to the reservation. All Apache are required to be under agency supervision unless formally contracted through proper channels." He produced a document from his coat. "I have authorization to escort her back today." Nahimana felt the ground shift beneath her. Return to the reservation, to her family, to her people. It was what she had dreamed of for months. Yet now, the prospect filled her with unexpected conflict. "She has a contract with me," Jacob said, his voice level but tight. Garrett's smile widened. "An informal arrangement at a trading post isn't legally binding, Miller. You know that." "And if she doesn't want to go?" Jacob challenged. "It's not a matter of choice. It's federal law." Nahimana found her voice. "My sister? Is she well?" Garrett shrugged. "I wouldn't know specific individuals." "She was very ill when I left," Nahimana pressed. "That's why my father—" She stopped, unwilling to speak of that painful day. "Conditions on the reservation are challenging," Garrett admitted with bureaucratic detachment. "Disease is common. Rations have been reduced again." Jacob's jaw tightened. "You're sending her back to starve." "I'm enforcing the law," Garrett countered. "Unless—" He paused meaningfully. "There is one alternative. Indians can legally reside off reservation if they're legitimately employed or—" He glanced between them. "Married to a citizen." The implication hung in the air like smoke. "That's your solution?" Jacob asked incredulously. Force her to choose between starvation or... It's not my policy, Garrett interrupted. Just the options available under the law. He turned to Nahimana. You have until tomorrow morning to decide. I'll return then to escort you to the reservation, unless circumstances change. After he rode away, silence stretched between Nahimana and Jacob. Finally, Jacob spoke. You should pack your things, if you want to go back. Nahimana studied his weathered face. Is that what you want? What I want doesn't matter, Jacob replied. You never chose to be here. No, she agreed. But I have chosen to stay these past months, even when I could have run. Jacob looked surprised. You thought about running? At first? Many times? Nahimana gestured toward the distant mountains. I know these lands. The Apache can disappear when we wish to. Why didn't you? Nahimana considered the question. At first, because I feared for my sister. Then, she hesitated. Because this became something I did not wish to run from. Jacob turned away, his emotions carefully controlled. Garrett's offer isn't a real choice. I won't trap you that way. A marriage of convenience? Nahimana asked directly. No marriage to save you from one prison by putting you in another is convenient, Jacob said bitterly. Nahimana moved to stand before him. Among my people, marriages are often arranged for practical reasons. Two people learn to build a life together, to respect each other. Sometimes, love grows later. Jacob finally met her eyes. Is that what you want? To build a life here? I want to choose my own path, Nahimana replied. Not have it chosen for me by my father, or the government, or even by you. That evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and reds. The question of tomorrow remained unresolved between them. If I return to the reservation, Nahimana said finally, I return to a dying world. Our ways are being taken from us with each passing year. And if you stay, Jacob asked quietly, I live between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. She turned to face him. But I would be free to find my own way, with someone who has shown me respect. Jacob took her hand cautiously, as if expecting her to pull away. When she didn't, his fingers tightened around hers. It wouldn't be easy, he warned. People in town, they wouldn't understand. Have they ever understood you, living alone all these years? A ghost of a smile crossed his face. No. Then we would be misunderstood together. The next morning, when Garrett returned, he found Jacob and Nahimana waiting. The small bag at Nahimana's feet could have meant she was leaving, or staying. I've made my choice, she told the agent, her voice steady and sure. This is my home now. Garrett looked between them skeptically. Miller, you're confirming this arrangement is legitimate? Jacob nodded once, his expression challenging the agent to question further. After Garrett departed, Jacob and Nahimana stood together in the yard, facing an uncertain future neither had envisioned months before. Are you sure? Jacob asked one last time. Nahimana looked out over the ranch, the garden she had brought back to life, the house that now felt like home, the man beside her who had given her the rarest gift, the power to choose her own destiny. Yes, she said simply, I am sure. In the distance, an eagle soared over the valley, free, powerful, unbound by the artificial borders men had drawn across the land. Nahimana watched it circle against the vast blue sky and felt, for the first time in many months, a sense of peace. Their story would not be an easy one. Two people from different worlds brought together by desperate circumstances, choosing to forge a path neither had imagined. But in a time and place where few choices were given freely, they had claimed this one for themselves. And perhaps that was enough of a beginning. The end.